All right, so is it on? Perfect. Okay, so tonight we're going to kind of have a brief overview over malware, the bunch of different types that there are, and to cover a little bit on antivirus. So let's go. So first off, what is malware? Malware is generally defined as code that's developed with a harmful or malicious intent, or has a harmful effect on your computer. It can take many different forms. Usually it's in the form of executable codes. It can be also scripts, active content, or other software that you download onto your computer. Usually it's designed to be undetected by your antivirus or security systems. It can be hard to find and remove because of that. Usually your computer malware can get onto your computer in several different ways. So if you click on links, if you go to bad websites and you click on something that downloads it to your computer, or if you're being directly attacked, and sometimes even your computer will already have some malware on it. So if it's supplied by a company, or if you, for example, have a CD or DVD that has malware on it. For example, in the Sony Rootkit, which we'll be covering just a little bit later. So like I said, it's either by direct attack or by mistake of the user. There's a couple different ways in which it usually is spread. The first, probably most common type, is a drive-by download, which is defined as an unintentional software download from the internet. So going to suspicious websites, or if you open a download that you get in an email, a suspicious attachment that you click on, it downloads, then you open it up, and then it starts running the software. So that's the most common type. The next one would be homogeneity, which is a different type of attack where it's actually more of a vulnerability because it's defined as all systems are running on the same operating system and are connected to the same network. It makes it really easy for worms, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, because everything's on the same operating system. If the attack is on the operating system, you can attack all the other computers that are within the network. So that can be kind of devastating, especially if you're working for a company and all the computers are running on the same system. So next up is a vulnerability, a security defect in software that can be attacked by a malware. So basically, it's usually a design flaw. So something that hasn't been caught yet in the software, or has been noticed, but the developers haven't bothered to update it yet, or haven't released a patch for it yet. If the attackers find it before the developers do, and they kind of take advantage of that, your computer will be at risk for malware. The other way malware can spread is through a backdoor, an opening or break in software, hardware, network, or system security by design. So this is kind of like a vulnerability, except it's intentional at times. Sometimes companies will leave it there, either unintentionally or intentionally, because they want to, if they're doing debugging for the system. Other times, it'll be planted there by malware, which allows your computer to be open for more malware to get in, and your computer to be attacked even more. So backdoors can typically be either intentional or unintentionally put there, depending on which one you got. So different types of attacks. So the first one, probably the most common one, is the exploit, which makes use of a known vulnerability. Typically, yeah, that one's probably the most common one out of all the ones below. The zero-day attack is kind of like the exploit, except that one is unknown, so the developers haven't found the vulnerability yet. That one can be a little bit more devastating for your computer if you have a pretty good hacker working on it and that finds it first and makes use of it. The other one, next up, is privilege escalation, which is when the attacker gains access to higher level security. So usually how an attacker will do this is either by gaining access to small amounts of data, or information, and then working their way up through the system to get more administrative rights. And then once they have more and more control, more access to the system, they can infiltrate it on different levels and to greater amounts. Yeah, in some ways they'll do that is, like another way they'll do that is by social engineering, where they'll either come in and they'll do it by talking to people, and the people will unintentionally give them information that they shouldn't have. So another form of attack is evasion. This is when the malware is designed to avoid detection by security systems. So when the malware is trying to avoid being detected by an antivirus or anti-malware system that you have on your computer, a lot of malware will try to do that. Not all of them will do that, as in the next example, which is the blended threat, which is when malware attacks multiple vulnerabilities or uses a smaller attack as a distraction from a bigger one. So an attacker can use a smaller attack which will be noticed, so they won't use evasion for the first one. So the person's attention will be drawn to the smaller threat, while a bigger threat is kind of going on underneath and will either be overlooked or, yeah. So moving on. So we have different types of malware. I'm going to cover all the ones on this list. There's several more that are out there, many different types, new types are being developed, and also different malware can be a combination of the ones below. So moving on. We'll begin with viruses because those are probably the most common ones, most common of malware out there. Depending on the source you find, it'll tell you that they began in the 90s or the 80s. The earliest I found began sometime in the 70s actually. And those were mainly just between like networking and stuff. The ones that began on PCs, so personal computers, began sometime in the 80s. And viruses, the main characteristic of viruses are programs or code that spreads by duplicating itself. So hence the name virus. These are typically extremely hard to detect. They can range from slightly annoying to incredibly damaging, depending on which virus you have. Typically there are three main types of viruses. The first one on the list is system or boot infectors. Those are usually installed, when they are installed, they end up being part of the operating system. So once they get into the operating system, it's really, really hard to get them out because they sit in the RAM, they're able to get into the memory, and are sitting in the RAM from the moment you start up your computer all the way to when you shut it off. So the best way, probably more commonly, to get rid of it is to kind of reinstall your operating system, which can be a little annoying to say the least. But those are typically a little bit less common. The next one is by file infection. And file infection is usually when the virus will hide in a file or executable, and so it won't be detected right away. This is probably a little bit more common than the system or even the one below, the macroviruses. So they hide in usually an executable file, and anytime you run that file, you won't know you're opening a virus, and then it'll open up on your computer and start doing more damage. And they can hide in all sorts of files, not just executable ones. They can hide in JavaScript files. They can hide in even screensavers and photos. So you really got to be careful with those. The last one, macroviruses. Those run off of specific applications. Those look for specific applications to kind of hide in, not just anyone. And sometimes, like there was one at one point that hid in Microsoft Office for a while, which eventually was found and it was shut down, but it hid in Microsoft Office, and every time the person would use it, it was used so often that the virus just continued to have more and more damage. But this type of method is a little less common than the file infectors. Okay. Worms are another type of malware. They're typically small programs that replicate without targeting specific files. Usually they'll stay within like a certain application or a certain part of the computer. They will typically destroy all the files and data within the little range that they're in. Sometimes, even though they're not usually specifically targeting, sometimes they will be, they can be really damaging if they get into the operating system. They spread via email, instant messages. They can also spread across networks really easily. They always stay within the application that they're traveling in. Okay. So next up is the Trojan horse, or sometimes it's just called a Trojan. It's defined as a type of malware, but I kind of view it as more of a type of attack because it's used in combination with so many other types of malware. So like a Trojan with a worm or something where you'll think you're getting something, but you're actually getting a worm along with what you're getting. So I kind of view it more as a attack, but it's defined as a type of malware. And it's basically just something that's disguised to appear useful. One characteristic of Trojans is that they usually, not always, but they usually try to create backdoors into computers. They'll also try to access a user's personal information, which can kind of be devastating if they get into your credit card information, your passwords, your usernames, if you store those in files on your computer. Trojans are often used a lot with ransomware, which we will talk about in just a little bit. They are developed occasionally by governments and by government agencies, by companies, and even just normal hackers. So, okay, so Rootkit. Rootkit is a collection of software that gathers information using other software. So it's kind of a collection of just a bunch of malware put together that also, so it's a collection of malware. It creates backdoors for more malware to enter. So, and it takes the information from those and sends it back to whoever sent it out. It's usually really difficult to detect the rootkit because it's using multiple malware, so you don't know where the attack is specifically coming from. It's especially hard to remove once it gets into the operating system. So again, you'd probably just have to reset your entire operating system if it got there, which could be pretty devastating. One really notable rootkit that came out, I believe near 2005, was the Sony rootkit. And what that was is it was something that Sony Music started installing onto their CDs that they put out. And what it did, it was kind of a copyright protection thing that they were doing. They didn't want people copying their files and then sharing them on tour or just sharing them with friends because they were losing money that way. So they added a copyright protection scheme for music CDs and installed a rootkit on every CD that they had. And when the person would put the CD into their computer, it would install the rootkit on the computer and you wouldn't be able to ever remove it unless you reset the computer. What it would do is it would modify Windows, and you would not be able to tell it was there. You wouldn't be able to remove it. It was kind of a big deal when everyone found out. And what it did is it allowed Sony to kind of spy on everyone that was using their CDs. It would send back information about just user information, stuff related to the CDs, and then also stuff that wasn't. So it's a pretty big deal when that happened. So that's kind of an example of what a rootkit was. And the type of attack that they used was a Trojan horse because you're putting it in the CD, so you think you're getting just the music, but then you're also getting the malware along with it. Okay. So next is ransomware. And ransomware is malware that encrypts or blocks information from the user, threatening to either publish or delete it unless a ransom is paid, or they'll even just leave it encrypted. This one is pretty bad because if you don't have the encryption key, you won't be able to get your information back, which is why it's really important to back up your data on a regular basis. There's no guarantee that if you do fill their request, give them the money or whatever else they request, that the data will be returned afterwards. So, and it usually infects the system from the inside. So if you're getting like usually an attachments from emails, or if it's being spread by a worm or something like that. And a really good example of that is WannaCry, the attack that came out last May. I remember when that one came out, it was a really big deal. It was shut down not too long after it came out, but it affected over like 200,000 computers in over 150 countries. And it would encrypt everyone's data, usually on, and how it spread was through old versions of Windows. It used an old version of malware, and then spread beforehand, and then later WannaCry attacked through that. So after it spread, it attacked using a different one. So that's kind of like a blended attack. So that one was pretty bad. Let's see. So next up is the Keylogger, and it's kind of, what it does is kind of just mentioned in the name. It logs all your keystrokes on a computer. This is actually most commonly found in like public computers in places, because a person can just a regular user can come up, you plug in a USB or slide in an attachment, and then there will be a keylogger on the computer, and no one will think anything of it because they're just going up to use the computer, which is why it's really you need to be really careful when using public computers. They can be used to steal usernames and passwords, credit card numbers, etc. Yeah. So those are not cool to run by, and another reason you need to be careful using public computers, because so you don't want to sign into your any accounts, like bank accounts or private email addresses or anything that you don't want anyone to get their hands on. Okay, this next one's called Greyware. It's also known as bloatware. I've heard it's been called a couple different things. It's a more recent term. It's used to describe unwanted applications and files that aren't really classified as malware. So they're not doing any harm to the user, but they're still really annoying. The first example of that is adware. It's really, really common these days and super annoying. If you're just browsing the web and you go to a website and then all these ads start popping up, and if you accidentally click on one, it'll download the adware, and then you'll just get more, and it's super annoying. And they're designed specifically for the purpose of adding cookies and sending you more ads. So that one is not doing anything specifically harmful. It is sending some of your information to a third party, but it's also just very, very, very annoying. Next one is spyware. This one is used to track internet activities in order to send you more adware. It's collected and sold. Sometimes it can be used to collect and sell an organization's information. So the spyware is more harmful than annoying at times. So that one's a little bit more of a concern compared to the adware, because it can collect a lot more information that can be used for malicious purposes. And one kind of small example of that is on Windows computers. When you first get a Windows computer, it's kind of a more recent thing. When you're starting it up, it'll ask you if you want the option to send them data from your searching and stuff, or how you use the computer, so that they can better increase user performance in the future. They make it really hard. They make it look like you kind of have to, or something you kind of just skip over while you're setting up your computer. But if you kind of look down in the bottom right corner, you can just say skip for now. But that's one example of spyware that's not necessarily very harmful, but it is a breach of privacy if you don't want it. All right, so that covers all that I have for malware. Moving on, we're going to talk a little bit more about antivirus software. I mentioned that, I think, near the beginning, just briefly. And what antivirus software does is its main purpose is to find and remove viruses or catch them before they go onto your computer. So kind of an overview of the development, or some of the early versions of antivirus software consisted of just a simple program that regularly checked like each and every file in the operating system and in the applications on your computer. And it would do that on a regular scheduled basis. This wasn't very effective though, because later on attackers learned that they could get around the scheduled routine checkups. And so later on they had to add, the antivirus software added the ability to scan emails and downloads, so all downloads that were onto your computer, not just on a regular basis. So it started checking that. Attackers also eventually learned to disable and they learned different ways to disable and remove antivirus software. So another way to counteract that in the development was they created, I think it's pronounced heuristic scans. And what those are is they check the behavior of an application or a download that you have, and based on the behavior, if it behaves suspiciously or if it acts like related viruses or malware, then it'll send you a warning, and you can either choose to ignore or acknowledge that it's a virus or malware. So those aren't always the best. Sometimes I used to use McAfee as my antivirus software, and sometimes it'll catch itself and it'll say that it is possibly a malware on your computer. So really, they're not perfect, but it's better than nothing, and they do work. They do catch a good amount of malware. If you do get antivirus software, you need to be careful which one that you download. There will be some websites that'll say they have antivirus software when really it's just a Trojan for other malware and backdoors that they have. So sometimes it'll be malware in disguise, and some of them just slow down your computer a lot. So just make sure that you get a good one, and I'll have a list in just a few slides of reliable antivirus software. So how to defend against malware? I know I covered a lot of different types of malware in the beginning, so what are some ways that we can defend your computer or protect your computer against malware? So first suggestion is to install a good antivirus software, which we'll have in the next slide. Don't open suspicious email attachments. If it's from someone or claiming to be from a company, check in with them before you actually download or open it up. So just avoid shady websites, a little bit of common sense, and just don't go to bad places and you won't get bad stuff, typically. It's a good idea to back up your files regularly in case you get ransomware, or if you get a virus and then you need to back up your whole your computers just to get rid of it. One thing that I recommend is using an ad blocker. So sometimes there will be malware and it'll pop up in the form of ads, or sometimes you'll go to a website and they'll just be popping up ads everywhere and they get super annoying. So there's one that I recommend and that I use. It's called the Web of Trust. But it's really helpful, and I would recommend getting an ad blocker for your browser. And then also, last but not least, it's important to update your software, whether it's your operating system, if they send out patches, or if you're just for any of your other applications. You do need to be kind of a little wary for if you get like spam or phishing emails that are saying there's such and such vulnerability, click here to download this patch or this thing to kind of update your software. If you need to get updates, especially for your operating system, you can just check in settings, have it check for updates. And you can go to just go to the official website and make sure that they're the ones who are sending out the updates. So the top two are antivirus that are offered or supported by ISU. So Windows Defender for the first one for Windows computers, and then for Mac computers they offer Sophos antivirus. A couple other ones that are pretty safe to go with are Bitdefender, Kaspersky is another good one. Avast and McAfee, they're both good too, and they're free. They're not as good as you could get, so I'd recommend going with one of the others. So what do you do if you think you have malware? So kind of some signs to check out for, things to be aware of. If you have extra pop-ups, like more than normal on your computer, even if you're not visiting sites, if you have extra spam and phishing emails, if your computer is crashing a lot, or if your applications will not open, those are possible signs that you might have malware on your computer. If you do have malware, I know there are some sites that'll tell you how to uninstall it and stuff. It's probably your safe bet would actually be to go to the Solution Center, to go to people who do know what they're doing. So their contact information is there. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, thank you.